Good morning. This is another in a series of interviews sponsored by the New Hampshire Bar Foundation Legal History Committee. Our narrator today is the Honorable Margaret Quill Flynn. Our court reporters and video technicians are James Connolly Sr. and James Connolly Jr. I am Joyce Donohue, and we are here at the Flynn home in Nashua, New Hampshire on Saturday, October 29, 1994. Judge Flynn is a Phi Beta Kappa. She has an AB from Boston University. She graduated with honors. She graduated from Boston University Law School, magna cum laude, in 1944. Judge Flynn was admitted to the Massachusetts Bar in 1944, the New Hampshire Bar in 1952. Fresh out of law school, Margaret Flynn clerked to justices of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court from 1944 to 1946, after which she engaged in the general practice of law in Boston and Nashua until 1986, when she was elevated to the New Hampshire Superior Court bench, where she served until her retirement in 1992. Judge Flynn was the second woman in New Hampshire to be appointed to the Superior Court. Judge Flynn is married to the Honorable Charles J. Flynn, also retired from the Superior Court bench. The judges Flynn have two daughters, Catherine Elizabeth Flynn, who has a law degree from BU, and Margaret Crimmins Flynn, who has an MD from Dartmouth Medical. Judge Flynn, let's begin with some background information about your family and your childhood.
Well, I remember principally my childhood as being a very, very happy childhood in a typical middle-class family home. We grew up during the Depression, in which if your father had a job, you were lucky, and we were lucky enough that my father did. I had three brothers, two of which were older and one younger. My mother was a homemaker, and I say that in the most wonderful sense of the word. Sometimes I wonder why I wanted to have a career, because she made such a wonderfully beautiful home for all the family. But anyway, at any rate, I at some point decided I wanted both homemaking and career. But it was a happy day. I can remember things were so different. You'd have the coal man that would come into your yard and deliver the coal, and the iceman came with an ice on his back, and nobody had refrigerators. Very, very few people had cars. You walked every place mostly that you went. But in those days, families were very, very solid. I never knew of a person in the whole town of Stoughton that got divorced. And it's perhaps some type of a family life that society needs to get back to today.
So, where were you born, Judge Flynn?
Well, I was born in Stoughton, Mass. That was a small town, about 10,000 people, just south of Boston, 18 miles south of Boston. One of its principal advantages, as I grew up, was its accessibility to Boston. We had great train service. There was a town next door, Brockton, which was kind of a good-sized city that had good trolley service. And it was sort of a small town. And in those days, you went to, if you were a Catholic, you went to parochial school, and then went down to the high school. Anyway, it was a very pleasant country place to be brought up in. I only knew, I think there was one lawyer in town, which I look back was probably an advantage, but lawyers didn't play much of any part in anybody's lives in those days.
Did you have a childhood hero?
Well, not a childhood hero, but I think as I grew older, I had certainly some role models, especially in high school, and before high school too. Amelia Earhart, for example, was one of my great loves. I can remember praying every night that she'd be found when she was lost in the South Pacific. I was a great admirer of Eleanor Roosevelt. There was a columnist by the name of Dorothy Thompson who wrote regularly in syndicated columns, I think in papers all over the country, and I was also a great admirer of hers. In fact, one of the things I first wanted to go into, I believe, was journalism. And I think Frances Perkins, she was in Franklin Roosevelt cabinet. In other words, I guess I really admired women who were doing things, and there weren't very many in those days, but they were really high caliber, the ones that were doing it.
And what about your early work experience? This would have been before you got into law school. And
Well, I'll have you know that I worked in the theater for the State Theater in Stoughton and sold tickets for 25 cents an hour back in when I was a junior in high school. And I got the job through the principal of the high school, and I guess I thought I was pretty lucky, not only because I got 25 cents an hour, but I had control of the passes. And I guess the manager was kind of generous, and he said, you can give some to your family and friends. So I really had a lot of my family started to go to the movies much more than they ever had, and I had some friends, and I was judicious even at those days as far as giving them out. But I remember the 25 cents an hour, and the admission was 10 cents for children, and I think 25 cents for adults, and 35 cents on weekends. And I guess that's the only work I really did outside the home when I was young.
Is that where you met your husband?
No. I met my husband when I was in law school. He was was at BU at the same time I was. BU at that time had a round the clock, so to speak, 3-semester law school. They ran it year round. As I remember when Judge Bounds tapes, Columbia did the same thing. The object being to give the men you get as much of their education in as they could before they went into the service, so that my husband really was any day going to go into the service too. But I met him at law school.
Oh, because I thought he was an usher in a movie.
Oh yeah,
theater.
he was an usher too, but he was an usher in Nashua.
Oh.
He's a native-born Nashua.
But you had
fellow.
that common
But in high
thread.
school, that's right. He was an usher, and also had opportunity to make friends through. Those were the days. I don't know if people don't remember them now. We don't have ushers, but ushers would have a flashlight, and they'd take you down to your seat.
Yes.
And seat you. And yeah, that's right. We did have some common experience with theaters. Though he did a lot of work in the playground, also. His father had died when he was in the 8th grade, and his mother was a widower, and he was the only son, his sister having died very young at 3. And so he had to really sort of go out and scrounge and try to, help out, because he wanted to go to college and try to help out. So he got every job he could. His great interest was baseball in his youth.
So you met him in 1942?
Yes, I guess first year.
Okay, and he was working.
Well, he used to work in the library when he
Yes,
was
at BU.
Yeah. But how I happened to notice him, I guess, and he sat in the front row, and I sat towards the back row, and I always used to think, who is this guy? He has this very loud voice, but that's how I drew my attention to him. And apparently, I don't know whether I had loud, soft, or otherwise, or a funny voice, but anyway, he also was attracted to my voice. Who's this woman up in the, the back of the hall, or the back of the lecture hall? And even as now, I probably always talk too much. I went to the dentist once, and he said, you have a very small mouth. Well, I said, my husband tells me I have a very big mouth, so I talk, but okay.
How many women were in your class when you were in law school? Do you happen to remember?
Well, when I was in law school, the classes were in transition, and as I say, it was 3 semesters, so actually I had thought there was 4 women in my class, but actually I think there was, there's maybe 3. I can't tell who was in the class and who was in the semester before, because we all graduated at different times. And the classes were really rather small. They'd start out big, and then all of a sudden the men had gone off to the service, as did my husband. I think after his first year, he got into the Naval V-12 program, and he was sent to Harvard for a year, which was really very nice. It was very close. We could continue our romance. And he was able to take not only courses like air control and damage control, but a number of academic courses. And he stayed there, I guess, a year. And what he really went for is because they were waiting for openings in Officers Training School, which was at Columbia. And he went then to Columbia.
So you completed your law school in how?
Yeah, about 2 years. You could do it in 2 years because you went round the clock instead of 3. In other words, you went, you picked up 2 summers. You picked up a year, and he went off. Of course, he then went off. As I say, was in the service. He completed, I think, well, maybe a year, and I forget just how much he completed, but then he went off.
So you became an attorney before your husband?
Yes, I became one in 1944, when unfortunately he was out in the. Oh, no, at 44, he had just graduated from Columbia Officers Training School, and he was still in this country. But very shortly thereafter, he went to the Pacific, and over to Okinawa and all those goody places.
And how old were you when you and Charles were married?
We were both 27. And when he came back from the service, he went back to BU and got his law degree. And he wanted to stay practicing in, he wanted to practice in New Hampshire, and I was practicing in Boston, but I was willing to come to Nashua, and I've always been very happy that I did. But I didn't really practice here until our first child was born.
Now, what prompted you to break the mold, to become a professional woman? Was there some relative in your life?
Well, I never gave it any thought, but as I look back, I had an Aunt Catherine, who really was quite a role model in the sense that back in the Depression, she was a woman that had rather a good job. She was a treasurer of an elastic web company in Stoughton, and I guess must have earned rather good money when the jobs were scarce. And she took me on a lot of traveling trips with her. Went to Florida and to New York, and I went to Boston with her maybe every week, and she had a nice car and could go every place. And I can always remember her, like some nights my mother'd be there cooking, the dinner for the family, and I'd be going off to Boston to her to some nice place to eat. And I said, gee, I don't know why, I said to her, why I ever would want to get married. Oh, she says, the best thing in life you'll ever find is get married and have children. So she wasn't married, but she thought that was the best. And I said, that's right, and get married and have children, but maybe you can have a career too. I always had in mind that I wanted to combine them, but if I had no choice but marriage and children, I think I would have chosen the marriage and the children, because children are such an absolute, total delight and fulfillment of your life. But I thought you could do both, and now, of course, it's very common to do both. In my days, it certainly was not. It was kind of a, well, I know it was a very unusual thing to do.
And when you first graduated from law school, you clerked for the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts.
Yes. That was a very interesting. When I got out of law school, of course, the war, that was 1944, was in full blast, so to speak, and most of the men, a lot had, for one reason, for physical disability or age or whatever, were still, in law school and so forth. But it was a very, very different time when the men were going off into the service. And I might say, though, we may have had some guilty feelings about it, it also was a wonderful opportunity for women. For example, the Massachusetts Supreme Court law clerkships for years and years were held by nobody except pretty much people from Harvard, or maybe a few from Columbia or Yale or something. In other words, it was a very white male prerogative, and they usually they had their choice of the best, and you would stay a year, and then they'd go into one of the big firms. And the judges were very much attuned, this is the way it is. But then, talent became scarce during the war, so maybe they called stooping, I don't know, to pick some women. There was 2 women that were, before myself, I was the 3rd woman law clerk. And actually, it surprised me, but I think the judges really enjoyed the women. There was two women while I was clerking then, too. And then I stayed a second year, and there was 3 of us at one time. In about 4 men, there were 7 judges in New Hampshire. In Massachusetts. And I really enjoyed it, and I thought the judges were. I felt no condescending or anything else. I thought that the judges thought maybe it added a little color to the job. And in those days, we were not assigned to one judge. We clerked for. I think there was at least six of the judges had their offices right in the courthouse in Boston, and it was a pretty heady experience. Actually, I was just about 22 when I started. The offices, the law clerk's offices, were on the 9th floor of the Suffolk County Courthouse, which at that time was a brand new courthouse. It's now really gone to seed in terms of they didn't keep it up, but it was new. It was on top of it was in Pemberton Square, kind of on a hill. The law clerk's offices were really very spacious. We overlooked Boston Harbor. We were right next to the very large social law library to do all our research. And so I have to say I really had a very, very good time while I was a law clerk and enjoyed it a lot. I might just tell you one little story that I remember very well. There was one judge by the name of Henry T. Lummis who was really quite a character. And there was a rape in Waltham by a sailor or something, and the case had reached the Supreme Court, and it was some kind of a different type of a rape case. I don't know, they had some unusual factors to it. I don't remember, but I can remember him calling me in. He used to call me Maggie, and he says, "Maggie, I want every rape case in the country on this point." So I spent the next week in all those dark files in the social law library in all the states from Texas to Alabama and Mississippi reading rape cases. And it got to be sort of towards the end, if any man came around the corner, I ran the other way. I had my fill of cases at that time, but I always sort of remember. But I got over that quite quickly.
Now, you tried to, you applied to participate in the Nuremberg trials. Is that correct?
Well, that was afterwards. Maybe before yes, maybe that was when it was at the end of the Supreme Court. I stayed in the Supreme Court 2 years, even though usually you stayed one, but I kind of liked it, and I don't know whether some judge wanted me to stay another year. And I might backtrack a little. When I got out of law school, and here again only because the war was on, I had an offer not only from the clerkship in the Supreme Court, but an offer from a firm called Herrick Smith, Donohue, Farley, and Ketchum, which at that time was a very large and very prestigious Boston law firm, which had one woman in it, and I'm sure would never have conceived of taking any woman, here again only because they needed people. So I had an offer from them and an offer from the Supreme Court, but I decided to take the Supreme Court. But I went in, I interviewed, and they said, we'll hold it for you. And then at the end of the first year, I went back and I said, I think I'd really like to stay one more year. And then I was maybe sad that I did that, because then by 45, 46, 44, from 46, I guess, all the men were coming back. But they said, no, we'll hold it for you. So they did. So at 46, then I was ready to go there. But in the meantime, there was some publicity out that they were looking for people to do work on the Nuremberg trials and to go over to Germany. And I think us three law clerks said, gee, that'd be really great to go to Nuremberg, Germany, and participate in the law trials there. And we all applied, and we all pretty much got the same letter back, that we don't take women on jobs like this. Now, of course, you never could get away today. And I think, I may have been wrong, I thought it was signed like someone like General Maxwell Taylor or something. Maybe I've got that confused, but it was somebody, and there was no hesitation in the world, say, we just don't take women. And we kind of resented that, but we all went, it just was, thought it would be a good experience. And we then, as I say, 46, then I went to Herrick and, well, they call it now Herrick and Smith, but it had the 5 names. There used to be kind of a joke, Herrick Smith, Donohue, Farley, and then Ketchum the business. If you want, I can tell you a little bit about that firm. Here again, it was kind of a heady experience. They had, their law offices were on the top floor of what was the old First National Bank building on the corner right on 1 Federal Street in Boston. And as I recall, the partners all had fireplaces, mostly, in their offices. Here again, they were typical, I guess you'd call Boston Brahma, most of them. They all went to, prep school, and mostly all to Harvard, Harvard Law, or Michigan or Yale, a few. And they all came from, I call Brahmin backgrounds, where they came from money, and they had all their friends had money, and at that time there were things like social register, which they would belong to, when their daughters would be debutantes. So it was a completely different type of person, but they were very high grade, very fine gentlemen, and really quite a delight to work with. They were, in some ways, very parsimonious, like one never spent one's principal, but on the other hand, they would travel and always spend money on, education, and they were fine, very fine people to work for, and I was very glad. Here again, it was rather a heady experience, and we dealt with lots of money there. When we got to Nashua, we never dealt too much with lots of money. As I'll tell you later, some of the cases we tried, if you got a verdict those days, when I first came for, $2,500 or something, you thought, boy, that's really, really great. But I enjoyed that, and they never had any more. The whole time I was there, they just had 2 women. And at that time, there was no prospect whatsoever that you would ever become a partner. And you might ask me about harassment or demeaning or anything just because you were a woman. And I haven't figured out whether I was too dumb to notice or not, but I never really felt any put down because I was a woman. I enjoyed the men I worked with, and maybe they put me down outside of my my hearing, I don't know, but at least in any contact I had with them, I just never felt awed because I was a woman, and I certainly was. We didn't know the word sexual harassment in those days. I mean, if somebody said something, you came right back with a good comment to equal what they said, and I don't think we even thought of it. It was maybe play, but I just never seemed to have experienced it. I was telling that to one of my daughters, and they said, well, maybe you weren't sexy enough to engender it. I don't know. But anyway, I was just very glad to have a job, and I enjoyed every minute I was there. Yes. In those days, the big firms all specialized, though nothing to the extent that they do today, because there weren't that many fields of the law. But I early on got into the field of trusts and estates. They had lots of wealthy clients that, for planning estates, and also that involved in some corporate work and some real estate work in the course of that. But pretty much I did that while I was there. It's interesting too. I think in those days the larger firms, did not have litigation departments. In fact, I thought it was a little demeaning for firms to get involved in litigation. That was kind of dirty. Well, not, but it was really rough and tough. And they may have done some in the corporate field, corporations and business, but anything like tort cases, they always referred. There was a firm, Brickley, Sears and Cole, in the same floor, and I think they handled any type of litigation. Of course, as time went on, every firm got really into litigation. That became a big part of everybody's practice. But in those days, it was quite genteel and very much the old buddy, old boy system. They'd have lunch, every partner's lunch at the Union Club or the Algonquin Club or something like that every week. And certain partners would go to the Boston Symphony Orchestra every Friday afternoon. But anyway, I loved every minute of it. And
are you in touch with any of the people you worked with back then?
Not too much. Well, there was one woman that I worked with that I was in touch with, and so no, I haven't kept, because they're all getting old like myself, and lots of them are not practicing anymore, and of course very many of them died. But there were some excellent lawyers, top-notch lawyers in the firm.
And Herrick & Smith, it's still there?
No, Herrick & Smith in 1987, I think it was 87, they disbanded as a firm. Oh. And it was quite a shock to the whole community. I don't know whether it was that they had moved to brand new offices in the new First National Bank building in Boston, and I don't know whether I never really got the idea. I wondered why they did, but they did disband. Whether the older partners were still drawing more than the younger partners thought they should, or the younger partners had certainly a different type view of how law practice should be. I don't know why, but they did disband in 1987.
But you were there from 46 to 58?
Yeah, 58.
And so you were married part of the time you were with Herrick and Smith?
Yeah, that's right. I was married I was married in 1950.
Okay.
I had worked at Herrick and Smith's from 1944 to 1950, and after I got married, I stayed on from 1950 to 1950. 1950, end of 1958. I was there 12 years.
And did you commute?
Yes, I commuted every day from Nashua.
On the train?
On the train. It was great. I wish they had it now. It was an hour's ride to Boston. You could work, you could look at the view, you could talk. It was a wonderful way to go to Boston. And I just look today at these poor people on Route 3 that are traffic jams constantly, and then they have to pay $12 or $15 to park. And this was great. You just walked right up from the North Station, and I liked it. But then that, of course, and it was very, very inexpensive. You bought your tickets by the month.
So who took care of the children?
Well, I didn't. I dropped Herrick Smith when I had my first daughter.
Oh, I see.
I wasn't going to commute at that point because I waited too long to ever. And I mean, I wanted him, and so I said I'll stay home and I'll go in with my husband. So in 1960, I went in with my husband early in Flynn.
In Nashua.
In Nashua.
And that brings us to some of these cases that you argued.
Yeah.
The first one that you wanted to talk about was Bedell v. Davis at 202
okay.
Fed Second 1. That's a 1953 case.
Yeah. Well, let me fill you a little bit in the background. I was able to, as I say, I had one child first, and then of course I had my second daughter. But our law office was about 10 minutes. I was probably driving 5 minutes from the house. Also, my husband, we lived with my husband's mother because she was a widow and had nobody but my husband. So we always had a babysitter, and I really wanted to enjoy my kids. They were young. And so in the beginning, I did, for example, a lot of the briefs. I would write all the briefs for the office and maybe requests for instructions and all of those things because I could do them on my own time. And so I did write a lot of the briefs. But getting back to that Bedell case, that was a case that I argued while I was still practicing in Boston. That was
1953.
1953. Yes. And I argued that case in it was in the Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston. And I argued it because my husband had a sore throat or laryngitis or something, and really fairly close to the time of argument, he couldn't do it. So I had to fill in. And, you know, I hadn't written the brief, so I wasn't all that much familiar with the case. But anyway, I just remembered that I was kind of terrified because I don't think hardly any women argued, and there was hardly any women lawyers anyway, but not very many of them argued in the Circuit Court of Appeals. And the judge, Magruder, who was the chief judge of the court, I don't think took too kindly maybe to women because I couldn't get 3 words out that he didn't have questions. So my argument was completely you know, sort of thrown out of whack by all the questions that he asked. And it really was interesting. It was a case, here again, the small case, where somebody fell into a grease pit. Remember in the old days, every service station, they had these grease pits. And this woman went to get her car, something done, and she got out of the car and she slipped on some oil or something, and she fell into the grease pit. But they said, no, that was she shouldn't have got near there, and that was contributory negligence as a matter of law. And his name Magruder felt so strongly that she shouldn't have gotten a verdict in the lower court that he wrote a concurring opinion that she was only a gratuitous licensee. She shouldn't even have been near the grease pit, and she parked her car quite close to it, and she was. It seemed to me it was a very wrong decision, but however, that was the first case, and I lost that one.
So that turned on an issue of contributory negligence.
Yeah, in those days you didn't have comparative negligence. It's either for contributory negligence, and they had gotten a verdict in the lower court, which of course then they lost.
Your firm had gotten that verdict.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Charlie and Bob Burley and my husband were partners, and they did a lot of trial work. But in those days, you did everything you could get. I mean, you did trial work, but I mean, some lawyers did more trial work than others. And Bob Early Sr. was a very good trial lawyer. He really knew how to, handle juries. My husband learned a lot from him.
And then there was another case you had mentioned, Siroy.
Siroy. This when I came to Nashua to practice law, and the Siroy case was at 1950.
That's 1960, and that's at 103 New Hampshire.
1960. That's right, because I didn't come. I started practicing law in Nashua in 1960, and that was the first case that I argued. And I can remember I had a lot of trepidation of arguing that in the Supreme Court. The reason being, Nashua, of course, was a smaller city at that time, only about 32,000. You knew people. And I think my husband really had to convince the clients that I could argue the case because I was a woman, and naturally there was 2 women lawyers in Nashua at that time. And in the back of my mind, it worried me very greatly that if I lost the case, they would blame my husband, and they would say, well, you let a woman argue it, and you wouldn't mind, but the case was such a simple case, it never should have gone up to Supreme Court anyway. I was talking with Joyce earlier, sometimes in those days, people took the insurance companies took the cases up to the Supreme Court anyway, but there was just 2 very, kind of simple questions of evidence whether Mr. Early, who had argued it to the jury, had committed prejudice so that the jury was tainted by his final argument. So there were just 2 evidence questions. One of them was he asked the doctor for the defendant, well, how much are you getting paid to come to court here today? And the doctor, who was a well-known doctor, did all defense work. He said, well, I think I might charge around $50. And then he argues to the jury, see, his testimony is going to depend on how much he's going to get. And then in another case, the lawyer argued to the jury, well, of course, this plaintiff had 6 mouths to feed, so of course he's going to work with pain. Well, anyway, there was arguments for mistrial, and the judge, I forget who the judge, the lower court judge, but he very, very carefully instructed the jury to disregard any of the comments, to take it from their mind. They were simply not to have any prejudice or any sympathy. And I think the lawyer, Mr. Early, withdrew it and said, I'm sorry, I said these things. And so the Supreme Court said, you've cured it. There was no basis for a mistrial. But anyway, I was thrilled, even simple as the case was, I was thrilled to win it, just so they couldn't say I lost it because I was a woman. I don't think the women have that today because women are arguing. If you look at the Supreme Court reporter in New Hampshire now, you'll find any number of women arguing cases all the time. And then when you have someone like Marcia Clark, I don't want to talk about the O.J. Simpson case, but or Hillary Rodham Clinton, or all these other women in the Clinton administration, it's now sort of part of the scenery. It's not unusual. It's not something that, that's a woman. They always used to say a lady lawyer. So you weren't a lawyer, you were a lady lawyer. I don't know if they still do that. But I'm just getting into this to just tell you how times have changed. And certainly for women, they have changed, very much for the better.
Yeah, but your husband knew you could do it.
Well, it may have been he was too busy. I don't know. But no, I think he wanted me to do it because I thought then he figured if I did well on that, he could give me some others, and he was busy doing the trial. He was doing well. He was very busy in those days. He worked nights and weekends, as so many did, just trying to keep a cash flow coming. So he needed the help. And the others I had spent I did all the briefs, and I think he felt, well, you did the brief, you ought to deserve to argue it.
And then you wanted to discuss the American Motorist Insurance Company, the Nashua Lumber Company. Well,
I'm only discussing ones now that we won, you see, but we did win the Siroy case. Well, I only mention it because it was 2 insurance companies fighting as to whether which, if any, policy covered, I think it was called loading and unloading operation. There were four law firms involved in this case, and it was a case of first interpretation in New Hampshire of the words loading and unloading, and the Supreme Court went along with what we argued was our interpretation, And so they upheld the verdict of the the lower court on that issue of interpretation. I think there was another question of whether timely notice had been given. But anyway, that was we scored that up as a win. And that was almost the same day as the Sirois case, or the next day, I forget.
Yes, Sirois is at 103 New Hampshire 113, and American Motorist is at 103 New Hampshire 147.
See, I didn't get upset as a woman arguing that case because there was about 4 lawyers involved, and nobody got excited over unloading and loading operations or what it was all about. And it was only insurance companies anyway, so I didn't get as excited over that one as
But you won anyway.
The client, yeah.
And then, let's see, what's the next case that you were going to talk about? Cakavisti v. Sprague Electric, 102 New Hampshire 266. Actually, that was a 1959 case.
1959. Here again, I just point out that hardly any women were involved in arguing any cases in 1959. So I thought, these things were really an opportunity. But if the case presented some unusual issues, I was particularly interested in, or something that might have some portent for the future. And this Cakavisti case, she worked, I think, at Sprague Electric Company, and she did some little operation, which I think probably, and people do so much now, but some little thing like cleaning wires with a little brush and using her thumb and squeezing, and she did that same little operation with the thumb, 8 hours a day, and finally ended up with carpal tunnel syndrome, which was kind of even perhaps a new term in those days, too. And the insurance company said wouldn't provide any coverage. They said, well, that's not, you have to give coverage, it has to be an accidental injury arising in and out of the course of your employment. And their contention was, well, she used that thumb, she intended to use that thumb, so it was not accidental. And there was a split in the country at that time as to whether that would be considered accidental, what something that you did, intended to do. But here again, the Supreme Court went along with our side and found that that was accidental in it, arising in and out of the course of employment. And thereafter, every case, and there's a lot of carpal syndrome cases, that sort of settled the law.
So that was
in that area.
That was the first one in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think that was the first one that said that was an accidental injury, that even though you did some intentional act. So that was, you like to win them.
And then there was Christian v. Eldon, 107 New Hampshire 229. That's a 1966 case.
Yeah, I think that was also interesting. Just as we sit here and look out the window. That case involved a suit against the Eldon Riding School, which, beginning in 1941, was right across the street, and there was a big white barn, and they had a big riding ring, and they had a number of horses, and they used to import riding masters from Germany to run this school. But at any rate, how I got involved, how we got involved, my husband and his partner won the case in the Superior Court where this young girl, Sandra Christian, was taking riding lessons, and she fell off the horse and got injured. And then, as far as the negligence that was asserted, was that she was riding the horse May, was the horse's name, and May that day was in a bad mood. And even when she was walking the horse, she could not control it, and she wanted to get off once. She told us Hans Christ, the riding master, she was scared and she didn't want to ride him. But I guess in those days you taught them by saying, get right back up and, go ahead. And one of the things the Supreme Court said, that the other horse, May, April and May were the horses' names. April also was in a bad mood that day. And she was in such a bad mood, he had to punish her by putting her back in the stable. And this was one of the arguments. He should have known that while May ordinarily was a fine horse, this wasn't her day. But anyway, when he got Sandra back up to ride, instead of walking, he made the horse canter, and which was one of the fastest procedures a horse does. So that anyway, she fell off the horse and got injured, and then my husband Bob won it in the Superior Court, and then the case was appealed to the Supreme Court. And one of the issues was whether, first of all, was there any negligence, and the Supreme Court found there was negligence, that this Hans Christ was a very experienced riding master. He knew horses and should have known that this day that this horse was, that this young girl couldn't handle her. Then there's also a question of apparent authority. Apparently Eldon at that point used to let him run the school and collect all the money. They were so interested in horses, they were willing to do that. But of course he didn't have any money, so of course they sued the Eldons. But here again, the Supreme Court found apparent authority, apparent agency, that people would have relied that the Eldons were running it. Another interesting factor, too, is the Horsemen's Protective Association came in as an amicus curiae, and Bill Finney, who was one of the leading lawyers in Manchester, came in and argued the case for the Horsemen's Association. And I suppose always they just don't want liability on the part of, they want to keep riding as a sport and so forth. And I guess one of his arguments, look, when you go to, when you get up on a horse, among other things, he said there's no negligence, but when you get up on a horse, you must know, and maybe you're going to fall off. But the Supreme Court didn't buy that either. But at any rate, it's interesting because we bought the house right across where we are now from the Eldon Riding School, and it was still the Eldon Riding School when we bought it, but they weren't running it actively at that point, but they were boarding horses, and family, friends, and things used to walk right across the way. And the one reason I was glad we got rid of it, because every time they rode the horses, there used to be quite a lot of sand, or they'd make some, they would blow across, not sand or soil or something. They kind of rough up things. But anyway, I thought it was interesting, and it was just fortuitously we bought, the house across the street from it. And then later on, of course, as you see now, the barn burnt down. Some kids burnt down the barn later, and then somebody bought the lot and built a house on it.
And you made the observation that these opinions were short and concise.
Yeah, I was just saying, in the old days, if you look at the Supreme Court reporters, the opinions were mostly very short and concise. Particularly you and I were talking about Judge Kennison, who was very short and had some marvelous language, would just catch the spirit of what he wanted to say. Now some of the Supreme Court opinions go pages and pages, and of course if you want to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, they go sometimes half a volume. But
and you were mentioning that dictionary that Judge Kennison
what do we call it? Ambrose Bierce?
Bierce, the Devil's Dictionary. He was quite a...
I think that's where he got a lot of his very colorful language, and he used to tell us that. He used to go and study and look at things he could use in his opinion.
He used to read to us in class from that dictionary.
Is that so? That's why you're very familiar with it, yes. I don't know if it's around today. I'm sure it was. I'll
get you a copy.
Never seen it. I'd like to look at it.
I'll get you a copy.
Yeah.
Okay, now, Judge Flynn, in 1986, you were elevated to the New Hampshire Superior Court.
That's right.
And would you like to elaborate on what that experience was like?
Well, I guess I want to say in the first place that I had no thought in the world of ever, no desire, or any thought of ever going on the Superior Court. My husband had been on it since 1967, and he was. I thought one judge in the family was really quite enough, and since my husband had gone on to the Superior Court, my work had taken kind of a different direction. I used to work with him in a lot of in the trial aspects of cases, and as I say, in appellate work and so forth, and requests for instructions and doing a lot of that. But once he went on to the Superior Court, he didn't want me to have anything to do to get near the Superior Court, because at that time there was just 8 judges, and it was really quite a collegial group, and everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew everybody's wife, and there would be a number of educational seminars that you would go to. And so you really did get quite friendly, and have some, and oftentimes, like Judge Can, they'd have you up for a Christmas party or a cookout or something like that. So, and I think he was right that it was just, the association was just a little too close, and I should just, go my way in other directions. So I did, and also at that time, and I'll probably discuss this later, I did get into a lot of public service things that really very much interested me. So when I was asked to be on the Superior Court, I guess I can say this. I said to the person quite quickly, I said, no, I'm too old. And I had never and I came home and I told that to my husband, and maybe part of the reason I said it, because I didn't know how even he might react, you know, if I said, you know, yes or something, but I said I'm too old. And I can remember when I said, he said, what the hell you mean you're too old? Call him up and tell him you're not too old. And then he cited a couple of other judges who had gone on in their early 60s too. So
how does that work? I mean, did someone call you? Did
well,
Sununu call you?
No, not Sununu, but someone in the you know, in the powers that be. And then I didn't hear anything for about a year. Then it said that Sununu didn't want a husband and wife team on the bench. Then I got another call, and they said, were you still interested? I said, yes. I said, I thought Sununu didn't want a husband and wife team on the bench. He's changed his mind. So, I mean, it was just something completely fortuitous that that I went on to the bench.
Are the Flynns the only husband and wife team that ever served on the...
Well, in New Hampshire. I'm sure down in Boston they have the Zobels, and then throughout the country there are some...
but you've got that distinction.
Yeah, that's right. We were the only first husband and wife...
and the only one.
Only
so
one in
far.
New Hampshire. So far, I hope it... I hope that there's more of it, because I think there's no reason that there's loads of husbands and wives in all kinds of businesses together. I can remember when I got married to marry a lawyer. I got married in 1950. It was very unusual. I mean, a lawyer marrying a lawyer was hardly unheard of. Today, it's so common. If you go to law school, mostly or practice law, you end up so often just marrying a lawyer. But as I get older, I see these great trends of changes, and I'm very happy with the changes, because I think they're all for the, you know, they're all for, in terms of women being able to assert themselves and not only be married and have children, but have a profession and be very, very good at their profession. And now that we have, and women that are very, very careful, I've noticed that always, any woman that in the professions that I know that have children, you know, are very, very careful to devote, you know, time and energy and make sure the children are well cared for when they're at work. And because women in professions can do that, and that's why, just proselytizing a little bit, but I hope they have daycare for a lot of women, that good daycare in places where they work, because it allows them to do it with a little less wearing themselves out.
And this question is from our history buff, Mr. Connolly. He wanted me to ask you how you feel about being part of a two-judge family.
Well, I liked it very much because, first of all, my husband, and I'll have to say this, and I think anybody would agree with me, was really an excellent, very learned judge who really was totally devoted to the court and very, very knowledgeable. He has a mind even, you know, he had a mind even like a computer. And even when I was trying to remember some of these cases, I argued back in the 1950s, 1953, just like this, he would remember the name, and I'd say, now, what was the name of that case? So he had rather a computer mind for cases, and he was a very organized guy that had notebook after notebook, and everything was all indexed. And you could ask him anything, and he could go to it. And so actually, you know, was an enormous help to me. Anytime judges confer all the time. I mean, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? But, you know, we could confer all the time too, except we were home. So he of course was a great source of knowledge for me, or where to, you know, find a case or anything right off the bat. So it really did make it, you know, made it much easier for me, and made it, and he had the benefit of really years of experience, because he was on, you know, practically almost 22 years or some such period. So it worked out very well. And you might say, how did it work out for our kids, you know, the honorables and so forth? Our kids, we never got a card that didn't say Mr. and Mrs. Charles Flynn. It never impressed them too much, I can remember. Even to this day, that's Mr. and Mrs. Or my daughter, someone say, what does your mother do? Or your father? She said, oh, they work for the state. It was good. So it was interesting.
We're trying to talk your husband into doing a video in
Well, I hope that he
spring.
will. As you know, he had some illness that set back his computer mind a little bit, but he's doing fine, and I hope he will, because he knows so much about the history. For example, just as an aside, when he first went on the bench, if a jury was in deliberation, you couldn't let them go home. Mr. Connolly probably remembers that, without declaring a mistrial, and so that you'd have to put the jurors up if they didn't reach a verdict, you'd have to put them up for the night. And sometimes I'm told over in Keene they'd put a few cots or something for the jury. And, or if it was a nice, in Manchester sometimes they could get a motel or a hotel and the jurors might get a nice evening meal or something out of it, not mind it so much. But it was a real headache, and it was a real headache from the judges. I can remember sometimes, 12 o'clock at night, the jury's out, are they going to deliberate, are they going to go home? And a couple of people, I think Carl Randall and my husband and a couple of others were involved in, we ought to change this law and let the jury go home and declare it a mistrial. So I think it wasn't until, well, sometimes in the early 70s or something that this occurred, that you could let a jury go home and come back in the next day and deliberate. And while we're on the topic of juries, I'd really like to talk a little bit too about women on juries. Practically, in the older days, there were practically hardly, very few women on juries, and it was a long, in the beginning, I don't think they could probably serve at all. And I can remember when I was practicing in Boston, I was once on a television show on an argument with another partner in the firm as to whether, and this was in the early 50s, as to whether women should serve on juries. And there was some question, even whether they were qualified to serve on juries. And I think in New Hampshire, as I recall, there was a law, and it didn't get repealed till 1967. They did allow women to be on juries, but if they wanted to be on juries, they had to go and appear before the selectmen and tell them, yes, I do want to serve. And of course, most women probably never even knew about it, and the average one to go and appear before the selectmen and say, I want to serve. So, actually it's, there was very few. It was mostly all males. Well, of course, now, it's more females than males. And in fact, and when I did an interview for the Bar Journal some years ago, I made this comment and how nice it was. But now, if you go up to the Superior Court, you'll find a woman, and say a criminal case, you'll find the prosecutor's a woman, you'll find the public defender's a woman, you'll find the bailiff's a woman, you'll find the clerk, the stenographers were pretty much always women. Those were the only women in the courtroom, really. And a good half to more of the jury will be women. So they're on all levels and all doing supremely well. But you couldn't have conceived of that. I can remember when my husband first went on the bench, that would have been, as I say, the only woman around was the stenographer. And now they've come around full, and nobody thinks anything of it. In fact, I also made a comment in that law journal, because it sticks in my mind, about, and this was back in right after I'd gone on the bench, well, shortly after, because they had, at that point, had appointed a third judge, but...
a third woman judge.
A third woman judge. Judge Groff made a comment one day, and he said, gee, it's really a historic occasion here in Hillsborough County today. He says, there's more women judges sitting today than the men. And I think there might have been 3 women and 2 men or something. But it really, really is a turnaround for years and years of a real male prerogative. And I say not to demean or anything, but I'm just saying it's wonderful that women who have talent and can do it, and do it, they do it on the basis of whatever ability they have. They can do it and do it extremely well. And there's some of them that aren't so hot, and there's some men that aren't so hot, but I mean, don't even to say they're all so wonderful. We're like anything else. It runs a gamut. But the opportunity is there, and that's what I think is great.
You've certainly been one of the trailblazers.
Yeah, well, I was early on when I was reading some article, and I might even quote from it, said even in the 1970s, women were still considered an oddity in the law, and maybe I referred to, they used to call them lady lawyers, that you had to distinguish them. So, yes, I think I was an oddity. I didn't think of it at the time, but back in the 1940s and 50s, that there were very few, but there were some, and they were all, they were all out there doing good work and making progress. And but we never thought we were making progress. It was just you were fulfilling the life that you wanted to lead, and you were hoping that others could do the same thing. I always would want others to do it and enjoy it as much.
Now, the Judges College out in Reno, was that something that you went to on an annual event, or just when you first went on the bench? No,
every judge had to go to what they call judicial college When my husband first went on the bench, it was down at the University of Pennsylvania, because I know I went down and the two kids went down. We spent almost a month down in Pennsylvania, and I know more about Philadelphia than a lot of cities around here. But at any rate, then they changed it to Reno because someone by the name of Fleischman or something gave a whole lot of money and built to pay for a nice new building out on the University of Nevada campus. So everybody goes out there now for, I think it's a month in the summertime, and it's a great, great experience. Not only do you see judges from, you know, all over the country. You can talk back and forth, but you have lecturers, and they, you know, top-notch judges come and lecture, and police lecture, and social service people come and lecture. And I can remember, and very, very helpful, we had I don't know, it was a series of 2 afternoons or something on somebody that was an expert in pedophiles, and I really didn't hardly ever ran in. I don't know if I even knew very much about pedophiles, and they were talking about the problem that it was, and saying even back then that really they didn't know anything what to do them. Almost you had to warehouse them. They still don't know how to cure them. And after that, you know, of course, the pedophiles have been in the paper constantly. But I mean, it was things like that early on. Another thing I thought that they were rating, what were the, you know, the how you rate a good judge. And number 1, you'd be interested to know, is to have patience. I think number 2 is knowledge of the law. But that's true, no matter how good you are. I think on judicial temperament, I think is so important. And I don't care how brilliant you are, if you don't have the patience and willing to listen, and you know, and keep control, of course, of everything. But just brilliance alone is not enough. You've got to have the temperament to sit and listen and let people have their say, not too much of, you know, not ride over you. But I always thought that was interesting, that the patience was the number 1 quality for a judge.
So how many times did you go out?
Well, we just go one. They'll only pay for you once. Well, I think now they have all year-round seminars now, and they have them just, you can go out for just one course, and I think now people go just for, you know, a week or something like that. But it was also a great experience to go out to Reno, and you also then, Reno, of course, is a gambling city, and some people went down every night to the slot machines, and then, of course, it's right next to near Lake Tahoe and Yellowstone, and so it was a great thing to run off weekends. And I went to visit my aunt in San Diego and a friend in Escondido while I was there. And
is that Aunt Catherine?
No, this was another aunt that went from Scituate to San Diego, and her son actually was senior deputy attorney general for the state of California. He died rather young of colon cancer, but he was, and we went to dinner with him.
Is that where Judge Grimes teaches?
He taught at, you know, he taught at the University of California for a while there at Davis, I think, or someplace, but then now he's at the University of, he's in Oklahoma, I think. I forget, but he's amazing. When I was out in Reno, I remember he took me a tour all around the city, and he lectured on criminal law, and he's amazing. And I'm just urging you to get him quickly on one of these tapes, because he would be just a fascinating person. He's in his, after he retired in his 70s, he had to, he's been lecturing at universities out in California and Oklahoma, you know, a regular full professor. And then he lectures at the Judges Judicial College every year. And he specializes in criminal law, and just a real great guy. And his wife, of course, wrote poetry, and she was, you know, a great source of support to him, and very much a very talented person in her own right. So get him for sure. He'll put the rest of us to shame.
And you had a lot of nice things to say about Judge Griffin.
Yeah, Judge Griffin. He's another judge, and I feel very badly that you didn't get him on too. Well, these were. He was a Renaissance man, a man for all seasons. He was. My husband said he was extremely talented. He could sit right down after a case, you know, after a very complicated case, and he'd sit and he could dictate the opinion, you know, right off, right then and there, and get it out, and it would be very well done. And my husband replaced him, when he went to the Superior Court, my husband replaced him on the he went to Supreme Court. Judge Griffith went to the Supreme Court, and Charlie replaced him in the Superior Court. But not only was he a great judge and you know, a very keen mind, he can do things very quickly, but he was a great raconteur, and he could tell stories and jokes and old times and all. So he was really a very and a very friendly, you know, nice, really great guy. But as I say, his talents off the bench in terms of raconteuring, and he always had a story, and I guess he had a lot of war stories, just like Dick Leonard. I don't know if you must have known Dick Leonard. He was a lawyer, and he was in the Air Force. A lot of these, you know, because most all of these men were in the service, and a lot of them would like, get together with war stories. My husband never won. He was in Okinawa and in the Pacific Theater for quite some time, but he you know, he was not a war storyteller the way some of them are. It was interesting, too, his group, he was on finally on a ship called the USS Lenore, and they just had a 50th reunion down in Durham, North Carolina, and we had all kinds of correspondence, and they wanted people to go. But my husband, he didn't feel able to go at this time, but he sent him a lot of names of, you know, people that they were trying to find. So it would have been interesting, but there was a lot of camaraderie that kept over the years in the for people that were in the service.
You made a comment to me that you think it's easier to be a judge today than it was years ago.
Yeah. Well, I say that in the sense that you have a lot more information available at your fingertips. Right now you have, for example, you have a criminal code, that you have rules of evidence. They now have a book of judges' charges for all criminal cases, judges' charges for all civil cases. You have a judge's docket book that they tell you everything they possibly can when you go on the bench. So you have all these resources right at your fingertips. I remember when Charlie went on, there was no code of evidence, there was no criminal code. You had to do all this on the basis of what's the common law. There was no code of evidence, all common law, which makes it much harder. Of course, there was no standard charges. If you're under charge, you'd have to say to Judge, you know, Judge Leahy or something, gee, I got this case, and he'd get out some old worn-out, tattered charge he had. And the judges were very good in exchanging their charges, but, you know, they were stuck in a notebook, and if you could read them, mostly they weren't, some of them they weren't typed, you know, some of them they wrote them right out in longhand, and a lot of them, like Grant, would give a charge off the top of their head, and they never had it ever written anyway. So you had to sort of put it all together, though on the other side of that coin is the cases were simpler. I think maybe the things, and of course the criminal cases, they did not have the criminal cases in those days. It was mostly civil cases. And some of the civil cases, product liability and libel cases, actually were more complicated than, they're more complicated than the average criminal case, which actually is, you know, fairly simple, the average criminal case, unless you get some complications. And as I say, everything's documented to help you, so it's but it's a lot easier in the terms that if you know how to use what's at your fingertips, you can make it easier. Now, but some other judges wouldn't agree, but they probably don't remember the days when you didn't have any of that to start with.
Do any cases come to mind that stand out when you were sitting on the bench? You mentioned to me something about a Playboy case and a New York attorney. And
oh, well, I guess that was one of Charlie's case. It went on for my husband's case. Roy Ruttman, I think. He was a famous lawyer and handled libel cases. And it was some Playboy magazines that they were trying to, I guess, little sedate New Hampshire would think that that wasn't probably a proper magazine to have. But anyway, it was a big libel case, and it lasted. And he came on from New York, and he had some of these lawyers from the other cities. Well, I'm not speaking of him in particular, but I can think of lawyers coming from Massachusetts. You appreciate the New Hampshire lawyers. They're not as aggressive. They're not as, well, they weren't anyway. I'm not saying that they don't represent their client as well, but they were more civil, and they were just, and you had more trust in them. I mean, sometimes you'd have these lawyers from Massachusetts, and just the ones I happened to run into, and they were just a different brand. They grew up in, I guess, in the biggest cities, and there was a lot of civility, and there used to be, because there's less and less among the lawyers. The old days, the lawyers, you called them up, he said, I'll do this, yes, I'll do that, I'll agree to the case. Their word was their bond. I think that's beginning to change as the amount of, the size of lawyers. What, about 4,000 lawyers, I think, now in New Hampshire, and it's different. But there always was a nice civility and trust with the lawyers in the older days.
Do any of the lawyers that practiced before you as a judge stand out in your mind?
Well, I'm trying to think. When you just asked me, there was a number of Judge Griffith's son, John Griffith, was a very good lawyer, and John Broderick was very good. I hate to mention a few because there are some there that were very good, and they're not coming to my mind.
Didn't Endicott?
Endicott Peabody, yes. He's an amazing guy. He came back, and he must have been close to 70, but he took the bar, and he passed the bar. And he did some criminal cases, which I think he had a lot of trouble with in the beginning, but very quickly came on and learned the whole ropes, and he was still, handling criminal cases, and towards the end doing really very well, and quite a handsome, always was a handsome guy, and very, very articulate. I remember one day he was in court, and he has a daughter that's a lawyer in New York, and I know how proud he wanted to tell me his daughter was a lawyer. And it's interesting, I don't think I could imagine passing the bar, not when you're in your, he must have been in his late 60s. I think you might do all well on the essay, but on that, what's the other one, the LSATs, you might...
in the multi-state.
Not the multi-state is what I meant, not the LSATs, yeah. But...
so he was governor in Massachusetts?
He was governor of Massachusetts, just for one term.
And
he was a football player. He was an All-American, I believe, at Harvard. And,
he's a Massachusetts person primarily, isn't he?
Yes, and his mother was participant in civil rights cases, I remember. They were a wealthy kind of Brahmin family, the Peabodys from
But he's
from
up
Boston.
here now.
Yes, he's in Hollis, as far as I know.
And you've had quite a bit of teaching experience.
Well, I wouldn't say quite a bit. I taught both at Daniel Webster and I taught in the legal program, paralegal program at Rivier. I can remember Daniel Webster, they started out, it was New England Area Nautical, and they used to hold their classes in a big hangar. And I can remember one day, 2 days before classes started, Warren Redmond, who was really one of the founders of that school with two others, came up to my office, and some professor that was teaching business law took sick. And he says, I got the book right here. Do you think you could take over the class? And I said, well, I suppose I can keep one chapter ahead of the kids. And so I taught for a couple of years, just one course, I think business law. And then Warren Redmond also got me into, Governor Peterson had a citizens task force back in '67, I think, that was going to look into every aspect of government. It was really a very well organized task force, every aspect of government in New Hampshire, to see ways that we could improve, what we should drop, what we should do better, and they had all these subcommittees, and but Warren Redmond got me into that on the executive committee, but Royden Sanders, who had founded Sanders, was the CEO of that operation. And that was very interesting. I can remember going to visit the state prison and all these social welfare places, and meeting with all legislators and everything. And it was and they published a report, and I think they were trying to get an income tax, but the only tax, what they did, the thing I remember that stands out in my mind, they got rid of the tax on inventory, but got that business profits tax. There was a big fight. There was always a big fight. But they were trying, even then, there was a certain group that felt an income tax was much fairer. So they got the foot in they got at least the business profits tax, I think, came out of that. But even then, big fights over anything to do with an income tax.
I just want to list some of your distinctions here. You served as a master with the New Hampshire Superior Court from 1978 to 1982. You were the first woman to serve on the New Hampshire Board of Bar Examiners, and you served from 1978 to 1986. You were the first woman police commissioner. Was that in Nashua?
Yes, the policy-making body for the police force in Nashua is a police commission, and the police commission is appointed by the governor. There are 3 members of that.
And you were the first lay person to chair the St. Joseph's Hospital Board.
Directors, yeah.
You were the first woman to chair the Higher Education and Health Facilities Authority. Some of the awards that you've received: in 1971, you were named Outstanding Citizen of the Year for outstanding service in the cause of public education from the New Hampshire Educational Association. In 1976, you received the Distinguished Service Award for service in public education from the New Hampshire School Board Association. In 1984, you received the Ella Wheeler Award from the Nashua YWCA Hall of Distinguished Women Leaders. In 1985, the Robert Frost Contemporary American Award from Plymouth State College Alumni Association. In 1991, Citizen of the Year from the Nashua Chamber of Commerce. In 1992, you were made a New Hampshire Bar Foundation Judicial Fellow. My question to you is, do you think that these previous experiences enhanced your ability to serve as a Superior Court judge?
Yes, indeed I do. I think when you serve on the court, a broad experience with broad segments of society is very, very helpful. I don't know if you mentioned, I was on, for example, I was on the school board Board of Education for 16 years, and also was the first woman to be president of that board. I'm going a little bit astray here, but serving on all of these, and you mentioned it, and it's nice, but I mean, they don't amount to, they're small things. But the only thing that I think is important is you make a first step. For example, on the Board of Education, I was the first woman. Now there's been, I don't know, not dozens, but there's been a lot of women. It's very common. Nobody thinks a thing of it. I may have been the first woman there now, a layperson to serve as on the Board of Directors of St. Joseph Hospital as chairman of the board. We now have a second woman who's chairman of the board. There's now first bar examiner. There's regularly now there are women on the bar examiner. So I just think those are of interest, and I haven't bothered to list them. Is that there was a little start, and it became commonplace, and that makes me very happy. It becomes commonplace. You never even have to say you got a woman president of the Board of Education. It's just be a woman one year, a man the next. Fine. When I was first on, we had a chairman. He was chairman for 19 years. And the minute he got off, they passed a law you couldn't serve as president of the board for any more than 2 years. They put term limits pretty quickly on it. And the Board of Directors, St. Joseph, I had a total of 17 years on the Board of Directors, but they have term limits too, but they came in when I was on quite a while, and then if you're on the chair to go up to be the chairman, that doesn't count, so I was on there a long time. But yeah, they have experience in education. I remember we had a big teachers' strike, the only one we ever had in Nashua. You certainly learn. You learn an awful lot from being on any of these boards. The Board of Education. I'm also a trustee of Rivier College on the college level, and the Bond Authority was very interesting on how bonding works, and this is for hospitals and higher education. And the bar exam certainly was an experience. It was a lot of fun. You had and the bar examiners in New Hampshire are very hard working. Like in Massachusetts, they farm out all. Of course, they have to. There's probably 1,500 that pass each time. But in New Hampshire, you work with a little committee of lawyers, and you sit down and you go over your question. You can only have so many words in it, and they critique it, and everybody tries to come up with really a good question that's fair. Then afterwards, you correct them, and you probably correct them 5 times because everybody flunks the first time you read it. You're expecting really probably too much, and then so any of those things, they're all sort of a kaleidoscope of experiences that you can bring to many problems.
And I know you are eager to expound on women and how far they've come, and to sort of give us the long view.
Yeah. Well, here again, and I always start
Yes.
this all out, not that I'm a feminist, I'm not really a feminist, but I guess I'm always interested, I'm interested in what I call fairness. And it just seems fairness that if you have talent and ability, you should be able to use it and not, just be put down because you're a woman. I just think of all the maybe women musicians, and now we're getting poets and writers, but we probably would have had those back in the time of Homer or in the Roman Empire. I think there were still women who have lots of ability, but you just never thought mostly to ever use it. And I had just some little things I wanted to refer to here to put women in perspective in terms of how long and the long road it was before they've become kind of commonplace. I think it's wonderful. If a woman is commonplace, it's great. Just like I think it's wonderful when a woman doctor is commonplace. And they are now in medical school. My daughter was at medical school. About 40% of the class at Dartmouth were women. And you go in now to any aspect of any hospital now, they're when they do residence in training, and now when they get in, so many now get into these HMOs and things, but a good percentage are women. And they serve, a lot of women like to go to women, and that if they like it, there ought to be a choice to do it. But I guess I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'm going to put on my glasses here and see if I can just talk about a few statistics, because it really is quite fascinating. I'm taking some of these from Richard Upton. He was also a Renaissance lawyer, a man for all time. Richard Upton was a great, great figure in New Hampshire lawyers and the Bar Association. But he wrote a book on the centennial history of the New Hampshire Bar Association. And while New Hampshire, let me see, allowed women to become lawyers in 1882. Now that's pretty good. This woman by the name of Marilla Ricker qualified to become a member of the bar, though I think it went up to the Supreme Court because there was opposition. It took, I think, Judge Doe, 86 pages to explain why she should become a member. But it's a long, long decision that But anyway, she was allowed to become a member, but she never bothered to qualify because she was a member to go through the. She took the bar and everything, but there's certain things you have to do beyond that. But she never got admitted because she didn't do whatever steps she should have. But she had already been admitted and was a successful woman lawyer down in Washington. But she set the stage. But if you want to go back prior to that, if I can see some of my figures
Was
here.
that Charles Doe that you?
No, the Doe, yeah, the famous
Yes.
New Hampshire, was it Charles Doe? He was one of our more famous, among our more famous judges in New
Yes.
Hampshire. But in a book, I think it's the New Hampshire Bar Journal had a report on women in the bar, and they had some statistics and some information I thought was very interesting. Let me see if I can tell you this now. In 1869, Iowa was the first state, I guess, to admit a woman to the bar. In that very same year, a woman in Illinois applied to be a member of the bar, and Illinois said no. The Supreme Court would not admit a woman, and went up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And I'm wondering if I've got here, what the Supreme Court said. I'll just take a minute to read it. This is our illustrious Supreme Court in 1873. And it upheld the Illinois Supreme Court in its position that the privileges and immunity clauses of the 14th Amendment did not guarantee women the right to practice law in state courts. And I'll just take a few minutes to read some of this. And the court held that civil law, as well as nature herself, has always recognized a wide difference in the respective spheres and destinies of man and woman. Man is, or should be, woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently fits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. And then I'll skip along to this, saying the paramount destiny and mission of women are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. In the nature of things, it is not every citizen of every age and sex and condition that qualified for the calling and position, and it is the prerogative of the legislature to prescribe regulations founded on nature, reason, and experience. And also one thing I left out, very important too here, it says, the harmony, not to say the identity of interests and views which belong to the family institution, is repugnant to the idea of women adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. But there was just, I was thinking of this new book that's out called The Bell Curve, you know, your genes determine your IQ and your genes determine everything. And I guess the Supreme Court had that idea, the genes determine that you're just going to stay home and you're going to be protected and defended and, by your husband. Of course, it'd be nice to have that too, but anyway, I thought it was interesting. That was 1873. It took a long time. I'm just going to talk about New Hampshire. As I say, even though Ricca was 1890, New Hampshire's always been progressive. They at least went through but the first woman lawyer didn't come about in New Hampshire till 1917. There was one. Then in 1920, there was another one, and I believe she was which is interesting, in the Attorney General's office for a number of years. I forget what her name was. In 1922, there were 2 women lawyers. 1933, there were 5. 1941, that's when I almost started law school. Yeah, started law school. There was 10 women lawyers. And this is even more surprising. In 1973, there were only 17. Right now, you got me some statistics, Joyce, from the New Hampshire Bar. Right now, there's a total of 4,000, roughly, rounding off the figures, 4,000 members. Can you imagine 4,000 lawyers in New Hampshire? I really, as an aside, without getting people mad at me, I think that's too many. But there's about 3,000 of those are men, and 1,000 are women, and that women is about 26% of the lawyers in New Hampshire. Now, that's quite a one from 17 in 1973, which isn't all that. I think you were born in 1970, I mean, around in 1973, probably.
I'd been around a long time by then.
But I think those statistics are very interesting, and I called up the Nashua Bar Association, because as I say, when I came to Nashua, there was, when I started practice, which was really the very beginning of 1960, because my daughter, 1959, because my daughter was born in January of 59, and I took off after that. And there were just 2 women lawyers at that time, Lucille Kozlowski and myself. And now, according to the women in the National Bar Association, there's 73 women that belong to the National Bar Association. A few of those may be from Milford or Amherst or something, and there's 320 men. Here again, about 25%. And I think nationally, back in the 88 or something, there was about 20% women nationally. I bet women nationally are probably in that same figure, about 25% of the women are lawyers. So these are such amazing jumps. And if you read some of the, I was reading a Boston University item about some very bright women that they had. Jenny Leutman Barron, she became a judge, Judge Schofield. But mostly when those women get out of law school, very often they were in the top of their class and they couldn't get a job. I was also interested in Ruth Ginsburg. Remember who, my God, she was the top of her class in law review and everything from Columbia. She had a very hard time getting a job, as did Sandra Day O'Connor, who got from Stanford. Hard time getting a job. Because naturally people of that wanted to get into big firms. And it's only lately now that, well, I'd say within the last I don't want to put years on it, but they're all over the big firms now, because the big firms realize they've got talent, and they use them. And still, some of the big firms are kind of, I'm told one of them, a lot of them like to work part-time, the women in the big firms, which I think is great. They, instead of working 60 hours a week, or having nothing but billable hours, give them a little, let them work a couple of days a week. Some firms are very open to that, and other firms, including one of the very big ones in Manchester, nope, they don't want any part-time. Some of the bigger firms, I think, even now bring daycare, which makes it very easy. Well, here again, I don't want to be touting women. I'm touting justice and people being able to do their thing and do what they want in life. And if you can have your kids, and as I say, my kids, and my husband and my family are they're everything in my life. And I can't believe of life without it. Except I think if I had to stay home and do the wifely chores or something, and have that, and not have something else, I would never have been nearly as happy. And I don't think my kids would have been happy. In fact, there was some article in the paper not too long ago about mothers of successful daughters, daughters of successful mothers. I mean professional or industry or business. And it said most of these young daughters reported their mothers were very happy. And I think it's very important to have a happy mother rather than one staying home and feeling, gee, I'm sacrificing and I wished I were doing something else. So that's just the point of all my thing is to let women go out and do their thing and be happy. But first of all, families, and I guess I got to say, and we all realize that families have broken down, and one of the biggest problems in this country today is the broken families. But I don't think that applies so much to women that are in the professions, because their families, because they're able to take care of the families. I'm sure that there's some of it, but
and they're good role models.
Yes, and there's all kinds, and it's not 100% either way. So family, I think, if we ever get back to family, it is the basis of any, I think, a successful society, any society that's going to endure. And that's now all you hear after you put everybody in prison first. Yeah, it's pretty appalling. You think 1 million people in the United States are in prison, more than anyone in the whole world. There has to be a different answer, that they don't reach the stage where that has to be the disposition.
I just wanted to put one thing on your video about you. I haven't had many encounters with you, but I remember until we started working together in preparation for this video, I remember the first time I ever saw you. It would have been back probably in the early 80s, before you were put on the Superior Court bench. And I was down in the Hillsborough County Superior Courthouse in Nashua. And I remember what you had on. It was sort of a poplin suit. You just sort of walked by in front of me, and I just picked up on something very fine about you. I can't tell you what it was, but you got my attention. And then after you became a judge, I was over in Cheshire County Superior Court one day, and I had to go before you. I needed an ex parte attachment, and Tim Rogers brought me into judges' chambers, and I argued my case to you. You gave me the attachment. I was very grateful for that. And then you asked Tim Rogers to go out of the room, and it was just you and I there alone, and you were just so nice to me. You just, extended yourself to me and wanted to know how I was doing, and I just thought that was such a nice gesture on your part to reach out to
thank
me.
you for having said things. I always just like to talk with, and young men lawyers too, about,
I'm sure.
When they're first starting off and what they're doing and how they like to do it. And, well, thank you very much.
Well, it meant a lot to me. I will always cherish that memory of
thank you.
You extending that kindness to me.
I want to speak a little bit too, also of retirement. I never really wanted to retire. I'd still be on, but I reached that mandatory age of 70 when the New Hampshire Constitution says you must leave. I think the federal court has a much better system. You can take on senior status and work a couple of days a week. I've been at the law actually for 50 years. I was 44 to 94 was 50 years at a bar, And it's very abrupt all of a sudden, things that were so important, and all these books and all these notebooks we have, of course, we have, you know, all sets of reports all over the house and everything, and all of a sudden it's almost irrelevant. You know, you say, well, you've got to pitch these out. And so, but at any rate, one of the things I did to take up the slack is I went to Rivier College has senior citizen courses where you can you know, take the courses free of charge. And so I started out, first semester I took 2 courses, and I've concentrated kind of in the English department, even though I was a history major. And I've had such a wonderful good time in these courses. I took literature and the Bible, arts and myths and archetypes in literature, Shakespeare, woman as hero, some philosophy courses. I'm now taking a history course. And the grand part about it is you don't have to take any exam, you don't have to write any paper, you can enjoy it. And I've had at Rivier College just some of the most marvelous teachers. I mean, really exciting. So that was something for other people to go to college. I think it's wonderful, and it's a real, when you think if you had to pay the tuition price, it's you know, it's fairly substantial. So I found that of great interest, and I've always had an interest in books. You were asking me about great books. I belong to a great books group. It started in Nashua in 1953, and we went through 10 years of the University of Chicago Great Books course, and then we picked our own for 10 years, and so there's a small group still going, and just to you know, read literature and enjoy it. Since I've retired, my husband has had an illness, and so I'm not doing all the things. I'd like to do some mediation work too, but I haven't done any at for the time being anyway. But retirement is also time to relax and look back and enjoy what you've done. And I'd still rather be working if I had my choice. But it's nice to be able to read and do the things you want to, and have more time for your children. And I'm looking for some grandchildren too, one of these days.
Would you care to comment on the image of attorneys that prevails among the general public today?
Well, I cut out just recently there was a little Wall Street Journal poll, and it's very sad. I guess the only good thing is that the high percentage think that most attorneys are competent and well prepared, or in other words, they have the brains and the knowledge. That was, but unfortunately for you know, real interest in clients or greedy, I still have that. I may have thrown it out. It was really quite discouraging, the perception, and I think really that it's misplaced, because I think there's some lawyers that way, but gosh, I can remember lawyers that gave their heart and souls to cases. I can particularly remember public defenders who I'm sure get, you know, very little money, giving their heart and soul, and in many cases that I on the bench, very fine lawyers working very hard and getting good results, and having a high standard of ethics. And New Hampshire, I think, really polices its attorneys maybe a lot more than other states. I mean, they have a professional conduct committee. They also keep right on top of their judges. And so, speaking for the lawyers I know mostly in New Hampshire, I don't think those awful statistics of you know, the low regard, and that they make too much money and they're too greedy. I'm sure there's some of it, but I think New Hampshire on the whole has a very high caliber of lawyer. It's probably changing because we're getting so many. Back in the old days, there was, I think when I first came, there may have been 1950, maybe 500 lawyers in the state. But you can't let a few rotten apples spoil the whole profession. And I think the lawyers need to fight back hard on that. And I think we have Jack Crisp. I was just reading his recent address on to the Bar Association or whatever it was, and you know, he's saying that even though you're you know, your high ethics and work hard. There's ways you still can improve the communication, make sure that you keep contact with your clients, tell them what's going on, tell them what the fee is. A lot of it is just communication, and I think lawyers have to work on that and do work in time and do it timely. And I think they can work to get rid of that terrible reputation that they have in a lot of states. But here, like doctors, a few bad apples of malpractice badly. Remember that series in the Globe, but you can't condemn a whole profession for what some do. So I say more power to the lawyers to act civilly and represent their clients, and they're certainly needed in this society.
And you're still doing public service work. You're doing some work for nonprofits.
Yeah. Well, I'm on the board at Rivier College, and I have been revising their bylaws. I mean, to bringing them up to date. And I just recently attended a forum this week on the CLE forum on nonprofit corporations. There's a lot of changes in the law that occur. And I belong to Margaret's Place, which is something I'm very, very much interested in, and which is it's a group of the Grey Nuns of four branches of the Grey Nuns have established this. It's now in operation, but to take mothers who are on welfare, who have have kids that they have to single parents and looking like more generations of welfare unless you do something and get them off and do something for the kids. So they just recently dedicated a place called Margaret's Place, where they've admitted now 8 mothers with children. And the important thing about it is that they take care of the children. They have a daycare to get the mothers an education, to give them counseling so they get some kind of self-esteem, to try to get them some kind of a decent job, something to get them off the welfare rolls and back into being functioning people in society, and most important, to get those young children so that they also have some interest in education and don't look forward that this is all we have is this cycle of welfare. And these particular 2 sisters that run it here in Nashua have done the same thing very successfully down in Philadelphia, where some have gone on to college or gone on into computers or into accounting, and they get a house and they get their kids back and off the welfare rolls. So I'm chairman of the board of that, and I'm very interested. It's been a long, hard road to raise money for it and to find a place, and then to get a place to combine, about 40 million city standards, before you can open anything for. But the mothers have their own apartment. They have a place for their daycare, and so things like that. It's good to have time to devote to them, because you feel in some small way. You help to improve society and make life better for these people who are sometimes very often quite intelligent and fine people, but they've just had 5 strikes against them. Very many of them being battered women too. That's part of the. I used to say too, when I used to sit on criminal cases, so many of these criminals, people who are convicted and so forth, they get 5 strikes against them before they're born. The houses they come into, or the parents on drugs and alcohol and divorce, and very often reading disabilities and learning disabilities, and no one addresses them. And then some drop off, 8th grade, or as soon as they get to be 16, they're out. And so a lot of those things really have to be addressed if we're going to keep this great country that we have.
Can you think of anything we haven't covered?
Gee, I think we've already covered too much. I think we've covered everything. If I don't have any more questions, I don't have any more questions. And if our very patient photographers here don't have any questions, they'll probably be very glad to call it a day. But I certainly want to thank the Bar Association for asking me to do this, and I think it's not because I'm involved, but I think there's a lot of people that you want to get involved, while they're still alive, so to speak, too, because later on I think people are interested in history and want to go back, and not just with women, but people that remember my husband and other ones that remember what it was like back in the 60s, and just from, if you like, history. It's sort of like this is the way it was, and contrast it with the way that it's become. And so I think you're doing the work, and I have to compliment you. I know you're giving an awful lot of your own personal time and energy doing this, because you really believe that it's a good project, and I commend the Bar Association for doing it and finding someone so fine as you to give all this time and effort and talent, and also the Connellys, who I understand are making a very contribution of time.
We couldn't do it without the Connellys.
So we thank you all.
Yes, and on behalf of the generations down the road, we thank you very much, Judge Flynn.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having asked me.
Thank you very much.
Okay.